Record this talk. Okay, very good. And so, welcome everybody to this Mumble seminar. I guess if I'm not wrong, that this is the ninth seminar in the series for this year, and we are very happy that even though we were forced, of course, to give these seminars online, that they were attended all over the world, and so we had a great success in that, and we hope to continue this way. As you probably already know, the Mumble Research Group is a group in basically in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, with also some branches in aesthetics, so to speak. And so we are interested in many typical problems that concerns this matter. In particular, there are three research projects that involve us. First one is a national project which is on a typical philosophy of mind subject, that is the mark of the mental. So we are involved in a sort of project concerning the relationship basically between consciousness and intentionality. And this is a project in which the University of Turin is connected with some other Northwestern universities in Italy, such as the University of Eastern Piedmont, the University of San Raffaele in Milan, and the Institute of Higher Studies in Pavia. And then we have a project that is more close to what we will attend today, which is a project on project that has been financed by our San Paolo company on the relationship between fiction and imagination, which is another topic which, of course, is on the one hand is a very natural topic. On the other hand, it's what people would say. Of course, there is a relationship between fiction and imagination, but in point of fact, it's not so clear what kind of relationship actually holds between the two. And then the third project is again another project that is related to something that Kane works on. It is a project that involves the problem of the divide between, in a way, between perception and cognition. For we are dealing with the problem of whether there can be a sort of criterion in order to single out what are the so-called perceivable properties, the properties that are, so to speak, fall into the range of perception rather than into the range of cognition. You know, this is a topic that has been renewed in philosophy by Susanna Siegel, a very influential book on the content of perception. And it involves a great debate on what are taken to be the so-called high-order properties that people sometimes consider to be perceptual properties, and some other people don't, or it depends on the kind of properties that actually are mobilized. Some of the properties that Kane has worked on, for instance, aesthetic properties, fall into this range of debate whether they are perceivable or not perceivable properties. So these are the three main projects that our research group is actually working on, and our seminars, our talks are actually very much related to this project. So we are very pleased today to have here with us, or at least virtually with us, Kane Todd from the University of Lancaster, UK. As you probably know, Kane is an expert on topics that, in point of fact, involve this kind of subjects that I have already mentioned, such as, first of all, emotions and emotional properties. He has recently published and co-authored a book on that was published in 2014 by Oxford University Press, Emotion and Value. And he also has a series of interesting papers on the emotion topic, but also he works on the topic of imagination, and in general on the topic of this sort of weird properties that we don't know whether they are perceivable or not. I just want to remember a paper that struck me, for it is in a volume to which I'm very much related, for it's a volume dedicated to Kevin Mulligan, Mind, Values and Metaphysics, and he has this negative attitude in the book, because the title of the paper is Why We Do Not Perceive Aesthetic Properties. So today Kane is going to talk to us about imagination, attention, and transparency. And please, Kane, we are very happy to have you here.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation. And yes, it's a shame that I'm here and not there. But you know, I'm happy to be here. I'm not so happy to be here literally, but I'm happy to be invited. Because I can't see who's here. I can only see 3 participants. So hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. If I know you, thanks for being here. And if I don't, thanks also for being here. So this is a bit of an odd paper. In a sense, it's a bit of a hodgepodge or a mishmash of quite a few different things, which I'm sort of trying to put together. And as you'll see, the dialectic is maybe not as clear or as polished as it perhaps, well, ideally would be. That's partly, I like to blame lockdown here because homeschool when the schools are closed doesn't leave you much time to do philosophy. And one of the other things I think is that, to be honest, I've been reading more neuroscience than philosophy recently. And so in a way, this talk emerges out of a paper that is much more about the neuroscience of imagery and attention than it is about philosophy. But I thought in order to give a talk to a bunch of, I guess, presumably most people are philosophers, I should build some philosophy into it. so let's see how we go. Let's get started. Okay. So I guess insofar as there's a kind of overview I can give you, which is helpful. The broad aim of a paper, this kind of paper, I suppose, is to give an account of the phenomenology of visualization. In fact, that's not at all how this paper started, but I think that's one way of thinking about what I'm trying to do here. And of course, in a way, the contrast case is going to be with visual perception. And I'm going to focus just on kind of voluntary, willed, and conscious imagery, as opposed to kind of unwilled, involuntary imagery. Also, some people think there's unconscious imagery. I'm not going to talk about that. But I also want to exclude memory. So a lot of people, both in neuroscience and in philosophy, think that maybe memory and imagination are linked. I mean, maybe all the things we imagine are built from kind of memory images. I mean, certainly some neuroscientists think that. But I want to exclude memory images as well from this, whereby that, to be non-controversial, I'm just going to mean those images that are associated with some kind of sense of the past, right? The kind of standard stuff we think of as what memory is concerned with. So I'm not going to talk about memory either. So the structure of the paper is going to be this, roughly. I'm going to look at a particular kind of explanation about that's designed to show why visualization and visual perception are phenomenally similar. And this comes from a paper by Benson Nane called, in which he defends something called the similar content view, which tries to explain the purported phenomenal similarity in terms of the structure of the content of both states, and in which he gives quite a prominent role to attention and the way that attention contributes to the content of visual perception and visual imagination, visualization, as I'm going to be calling it. Oh yeah, I should say, sorry, by visualization, I mean imagining with visual imagery. So hopefully that's clear. Then I'm going to, in a way, sort of attack, I guess, this account. And I'm going to say that the phenomenal similarity between the two states is, at best overstated. And I'm going to be doing that by showing that the role of attention in each is very, very different. And in particular, the way in which attention functions in visualization means that it lacks what I'm going to refer to as a kind of transparency that visual perception has. So that's, and of course, I'm going to try to spell out a little bit what I mean by transparency. It can mean lots of different things. It's at the center of lots of different debates in the philosophy of perception. So I'm going to spell that out a little bit. And then I'm going to see how, what I say about the nature of visualization that emerges from this critique of Nane fits with the empirical evidence, such as we have it, particularly from neuroscience, on the relationship between imagery and attention. But don't worry, if you're not empirically inclined, that bit will go by fairly quickly. I'm not going to get bogged down in the details of the research. And then, maybe a bit oddly at the very end, I'm going to say something about the implications of what I've said for the notion of what's now often known as fictional immersion. Okay, now this is a bit of a hodgepodge. I mean, I think all of these issues are kind of related in interesting ways. but it's true that the final section might come across as a bit of an addendum to what's been said so far. So it'd be interesting to have your thoughts on that. Right, so let's get started. Okay. So the starting point for this paper, and then the starting point for Nane's paper, is that there's a supposed kind of phenomenal similarity between visualization and visual perception, which needs to be characterized and explained. Now, part of this depends on a kind of intuition. Now, I don't really like intuitions very, very much. And I particularly don't like philosophers' intuitions about phenomena. I really heavily distrust what philosophers call their intuitions about these things. But in any case, a lot of people have thought that seeing and visualizing have a very similar phenomenal character. So Nane himself says, if I visualize a red apple and if I see one, the phenomenal character of my experience will be very similar. And of course, there are obvious similarities. There are features that resemble each other, which I'm not going to go through. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of what these are. Nane himself doesn't make much of this. He doesn't really emphasize the kind of strength of this intuition. He doesn't go through all of those features, but he does put quite a lot of emphasis on the well-known Perky experiment, which I assume most of you know, but just to run through it quite quickly. Subjects are asked to look at a kind of white wall in the original experiment, and they're asked to visualize certain objects like a banana while keeping their eyes open. And then they're unaware of this, but there are barely visible images of the thing that they're supposed to visualize projected onto the wall. And the subjects then take themselves to be visualizing what they are in fact perceiving. Now, this way of characterizing what the experiment is taken to show is controversial. There's a debate about what the experiment shows. In particular, there's a debate between Nane and Rob Hopkins, for example, fairly recent debate, I think, about this. But I'm not going to get into this debate. I'm just going to take that as read. I'm just going to accept that in this particular case, what Nane takes this to show is that the phenomenal similarity between the two states is so significant, so evident that one can, in these kinds of conditions at least, confuse being in one state for the other. Okay. So, starting off with the observation and the intuition that the two states are phenomenally very, very similar, Nane wants to give an explanation of this similarity. Now, the paper is, quite long. He rejects something called the dependency thesis, which those of you who work on imagination will know all about. He also rejects another particular way of explaining this, which builds on the idea of the propositional attitudes and their similarities. I'm not going to go into that. I mean, I sort of agree with him. I mean, I don't think the dependency thesis is the right view of imagining. So I'm just going to look at his view not because I really want to. I'm not so concerned with rejecting Nane's view as such. So I'm not going to spend a long time for that purpose on rejecting Nane's arguments. But what I think is interesting about Nane's view is that it insists on attention playing an important role in both visualization and visual perception. And I think he's right that we should try to understand both the content and the phenomenal character of these states, partly in terms of the role that attention plays. But I think he's precisely wrong about what that shows about the phenomenal nature, particularly of visualization. Okay, and I think that's because of the particular role that attention is playing in visualization, which I think in a way he gets wrong. Okay. So I'm not interested in arguing against Nane as such, so much as I am in just highlighting the phenomenal nature of visualization through the role that attention plays here. Okay, all right. So Nane's view is it's fairly straightforward in a way. So he says, well, what is perceptual content? Well, here's a fairly bare kind of view of what it is that doesn't really commit us to any kind of very rich theories about the nature of such content. He says perceptual content can be construed as whatever is constituted by the properties that are perceptually attributed to the perceived scene and the objects in the scene. Okay, such properties, he says, can be more or less determinate, right? So he makes quite a lot of the determinable relationship, and he says attention plays a central role in fixing the content of perceptual states because one of the central functions of attention is to make the perceived properties of an object more determinate. Okay, now, for those of you who know a bit about this debate, this is another quite big debate in the philosophy of perception in particular, particularly in the literature on representationalism, and to what extent attention affects the determinacy of the properties that we see and how that bears on phenomenal character. I'm going to bypass that debate entirely. Okay, so I'm just going to take it for granted that something like that picture is kind of right. But I will come back to Nanet's kind of assumed representationalism a bit later. So similarly, he says we can think of visualized content, the content of visualization, visual imagining in the same way. It's just the sum total of the properties that we attribute to the imagined scene and the objects in the imagined scene. Okay, and here as well, he says attention makes the attended properties more determinate. Okay, so attending to the image of a red apple, my imagined experience of a red apple, makes the property of redness more determinate than if I weren't paying attention to it. Okay, just like it would in the case of visual perception. Okay, so this leads to both kind of similarities and differences between the two states. So it accounts, Nanet thinks, as I've said already, for the phenomenal similarity. Here's what he says about that. He says, look, the content of visual perception and visualization, given this role of attention, is structured in exactly the same way. Okay, because attention is playing the role of making more determinate the properties that it focuses on. Okay. So where's the difference then? Well, clearly, this is one obvious difference. The increase in determinacy in perception comes about, as it were, externally from sensory stimulation. Okay, whereas of course the extra determinacy in the visualized scene has to be provided internally. Okay, and Nanet says internally insofar as it depends on memories, beliefs, and expectations, okay, about the objects that you're imagining. After all, you're imagining them usually with a certain intention, and they're sustained by this intention, and you might be drawing on certain beliefs, memories, expectations, and maybe other states like desires as well. Okay, so that's the idea. Hopefully that's fairly clear. Okay. So let's look a little bit more at the difference then, because I'm going to make quite a lot about this difference. So Nanet says this, he says the difference then between the two states is between the dynamics of how the represented properties and importantly, the determinacy of the represented properties change in response to the allocation of attention. Okay. The difference is not between what perceptual content, the difference is not between what perceptual content and the content of mental imagery are, but between the way in which they change. Okay. So they have the same kind of content. That's the idea. But the sources of attention are very different in each. Okay. So attention to imagery is top-down and endogenous. Okay. It comes from us internally, while attention to perceptual objects is exogenous and bottom-up. That's how he puts it. Now, I think there's quite a lot potentially to be said about the relations and differences between the notions of top-down, endogenous, and internal, and exogenous, bottom-up, and external, which I guess we can go into in the questions if we like, but I'm just going to work with what's hopefully a fairly obvious distinction between the two for the purpose of the talk. Okay, so the question now is, given what we've just said about the difference between the sources of attention, how does this account, right, of the different roles of attention here in structuring the content in these two very different states? Explain, how is it supposed to explain the phenomenal similarity between them? Right. Now, what's interesting is that Nanet doesn't actually say very much about this. Purportedly, they're one of the main questions of the paper. What he says explicitly is that we know from various empirical studies that attention can dramatically change what we experience. And so he says it should be clear that the similar allocation of attention in the case of perception and mental imagery can explain the similarity between the phenomenology of perception and mental imagery. Right. So once we've got the role of attention in structuring the determinacy of the content of each state in place, and that structure is identical between the two, according to Nanet, that's all we need to explain the phenomenal similarity. Okay. Now, when I first read the paper, I was quite surprised that he didn't really say anything more about that. But I suppose what's obvious is there's a representationalist assumption here, of the form that the phenomenal character is just determined by the content. Okay, so there's nothing more to be said maybe about phenomenal character than what we can say about content. Now, of course, representationalism comes in lots of different forms. Nanet's paper is not, a defense of representationalism, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but that's that seems to be the clear assumption here for the explanation of phenomenal similarity. Okay. After all, if you don't buy the representationalist assumption here that character is determined in some sense by content, then we're left without an explanation of the similarity, given what Nanet's said about the content. So I'm not going to quibble with that. Okay, but I am going to reject the view. And I'm going to reject the view because I think that the nature of the properties that we're talking about, the nature of the attribution of the properties to objects, the way in which we attribute properties to objects, and the role of attention in making these properties more determinate are just sufficiently different between the two states. Okay, and I think once we look at how that is, then we'll see that the phenomenal differences between visualization and visual perception are much more significant than the similarities. So in a way, a lot of what I'm going to say now, if you're inclined to think about the imagination in a certain way, following on, I think, from a lot of traditional views of the imagination that come from observations by people like Sartre and Wittgenstein, Colin McGinnis wrote a whole book on these kinds of differences between images and percepts, you're probably just going to find kind of obvious. And to me, it strikes me that the differences are kind of obvious and the similarities are very overrated. But I think we can say a bit more about why that is when we focus on the role of attention. That's the hope. So if you wanted to use this as a kind of springboard to attack Nanet's paper itself, then what I'm going to now say would show, I think, either that, well, the content of the two states is just not the same, okay, and not structured in the same way, or what it does show is that representationalism is false, at least of visualization. Okay, so I think you could go one of those two ways, but as I said, I'm not particularly interested in arguing against representationalism, or against Nanet's view for its own sake. I'm much more interested in just exploring the differences between the two states in terms of their phenomenal character. Okay, so I'm not going to pursue that sort of argumentative strategy at all. Right. So here's the kind of claim I want to make. I mean, if we come back to the case of the Perky experiments again, let's say that in these very particular conditions, we are apt to confuse perception for visualization. Nevertheless, normally, and these are fairly extreme conditions, normally we don't, of course, confuse the two states. Right? We're not normally confused about whether we're visualizing or perceiving something. And I think the interesting question here is, why don't we normally confuse them? What stops us confusing them? And I think the best explanation is that they're phenomenally very dissimilar. Right? They're not phenomenally very similar, which is the kind of starting assumption that Nanet thinks needs explanation, and which a lot of philosophers do think is what needs to be explained. I think the dissimilarity is just more striking than the similarities. And I think the dissimilarity involved, or at least one type of dissimilarity, is partly a result of the different way in which attention relates to each. Okay. And in particular, what I want to show, and this is where the empirical kind of work comes in a little bit, is that the different sources of attention in each, so endogenous versus exogenous, or top-down, bottom-up, are what ultimately make the phenomenal difference, and also what maybe explains the phenomenal difference if you think that sort of neurological levels of explanation can help us to give philosophical explanations at the phenomenal level of conscious experience. And you might not think that, in which case that's also fine. I'm not going to give a methodological talk about the different levels of explanation here. Okay. All right. Now you might start looking at the similarity of the two states by looking at the similarity of content. That's traditionally, I think, how a lot of the work on imagination has been done by philosophers. Okay, so here we have, features that are supposed to be features of imagery that we don't have in perception, or that differ in certain ways from those features in perception. So, of course, Hume and others have held in various ways that perception is generally more vivid. Okay, and images and perceptions can be distinguished in terms of their vividness or their weakness. Now, of course, as a general kind of criterion, a lot of people have said that that's hopeless, because sometimes perceptions, are weak and sometimes images are vivid. I mean, I happen to think that actually that's a fairly weak observation, because actually I think rarely is it the case that unless you have hyperphantasia, I think it's going to be rarely the case that actually your imagery is anything like as vivid as your perceptions. Now we can then argue, of course, what is meant exactly by vividness, and that's another discussion that we could have. But I don't think actually. I don't think they're alike in terms of content. I think so. Looking at the nature of the content itself already puts us in mind of certain dissimilarities that we can stress. Then there are other features like saturation. Okay, so McGinn in particular talks a lot about this. I think Rob Hopkins has talked a bit about this in various papers. And this is the idea that in the visual field, our visual experience is completely saturated. So even if, as a matter of empirical fact, there are gaps in our vision, as indeed there are, and they're filled in various ways, nevertheless, it appears to us that our visual field is saturated in a way that our images generally don't. Okay, at least that's now I'm going a bit on introspective intuition, which is just the kind of thing I profess skepticism about at the beginning. But I think there are differences, in terms of just at the level of content that we can already point to and that traditionally have been pointed to here. This idea of saturation, I think, might be related to what Sartre talks about in terms of overflow. I think Rob Hopkins might call it the phenomenology of overflow. The idea that in perception we have the impression that the external world that we're perceiving goes beyond the bounds of our visual field. Okay, it doesn't just stop, whereas images don't seem to be like that. But I'm going to be much more concerned not so much with the dissimilarity in terms of content as with the sort of phenomenal dissimilarity. And here I'm going to be focusing on the notion of agency. Right? Now, one of the many weaknesses of this talk is that I don't really know, as you'll see, what to say about agency. And I haven't got around to looking at the sort of literature on agency in anything like the detail that I would like, certainly not in philosophy. So if anyone has any contributions to make from the philosophy of agency, then that would be great, and you can show me where I'm going wrong here. But I'm going to be focusing on agency quite a bit. So here's a basic idea about the phenomenal difference between visualization and visual perception. In perception, we're normally aware, in some sense, our experiences, and therefore the determinacy of the properties that we're attending to, are in some sense coming from the world. Okay, so here I'm begging a lot of important questions about what exactly the relationship between perceptual states and their objects kind of are. And I don't really want to get bogged down in the discussion, so I'm just using the word coming from here, hopefully in as phenomenologically neutral a way as possible, to just try to capture the idea that in some sense we see the world as being somehow responsible for the impressions that we're getting, right, through our vision. Okay. Whereas in imagining, of course, we're normally aware that this is not the case. Okay, it's not the world impinging on us, okay, or causing us. It's not that our experiences are coming from or representing or being presented by, depending on your theory of what perception is philosophically. All of these are, I think, consistent with this hopefully fairly obvious way of just pointing out the difference. Okay, and again, there's a sort of interesting question here. What exactly is responsible for this awareness in the one case and not the other? Well, I think one way of putting it is that I'm aware of the role of my own agency in constructing an image, okay, whereas agency doesn't really come into it when we're talking about the phenomenology or indeed how the content is presented to us in visual perception. Okay, now there's a big question here about what sort of state is this awareness? Is it a cognitive or non-cognitive state? Frankly, I have no idea how to characterize this, but I will come back to it at the very end of the talk. But I think whatever it is, this kind of awareness, whether it's a feeling or a judgment or something between the two, involves some kind of awareness or sense of the intention and effort involved in creating and sustaining images that that is not present at all in normal cases of standard visual perception. Okay. So, I mean, I find this so obvious as to not be worth stating, but maybe it's not so obvious. Okay, so I mean, what is true is that there's clearly some sense of agency involved in perception. Okay, and maybe lots of cases of perception involve some kind of sense of agency, and maybe that's the case particularly with higher order perception. If you want to call that perception, maybe it's the case with a lot of evaluations we make. If you think that there is such a thing as evaluative perception, okay. So there's a lot more to be said, obviously, about this, and this is just a rough sketch. So, I can be aware of my own top-down kind of agency when focusing my attention. That's obviously something I can do deliberately. I can try to go around the world making the objects of which I'm aware more determinate and their properties more determinate. But nevertheless, I think even there, the resulting determinacy is experienced as a mind-independent property of the objects in the world. And in this sense, the attributive nature of the perceptual experience is passive. Okay. And to that extent, perceptual experience is transparent to the determinacy of the properties in the world. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by transparency in a few slides. Okay, so perceptual experience, although it might involve agency to the extent that I actively pay attention to the world, the resulting experience is not one that is itself the result of agency or is somehow constituted by my effort and my intention. Right. So I just think attending to imagery is not at all like this. Okay. So in visualizing, I'm normally aware that the determinacy that results comes from my own agency. In Nane's words, from my intentions, desires, beliefs, expectations, and so on. The attributive phenomenology of visualization is therefore active and not passive in the sense I'm concerned with. The determinacy of the images is therefore not experienced as a mind-independent property of the objects that my focused attention has discovered. Okay, by a light, by just looking more intently at the property that is there to be experienced. Rather, in visualization, the determinacy is added and sustained by willed attention. It's not discovered, and this is a central feature of my awareness of what's involved in the state of visualizing, and that explains the phenomenal difference between the two states. And visualization is, in this sense, therefore not transparent. Okay. That's the basic idea. So let me just say something a bit more about transparency. Okay, so I mean, there are lots of different views of the transparency of perception on the market. Here's a kind of rough idea of what I mean by it, and this is partly phrased like this because I don't want to sort of commit myself to any particular view of transparency. So in the case of visual perception, the idea is that in attending to my visual experience of X, I am normally, in the normal cases, primarily aware of X. Okay. And in attending to X, right, then in attending not to my experience, but to the object of my experience, the determinacy of the properties of X is experienced as belonging to X. Okay, so this is what I mean by perception having a particular kind of attributive phenomenology that's passive in that sense. Right, our experiences seem to passively reflect or represent the external objects. In visualizing, when I attend to my visual imagery of X, I'm aware of my agency, I think, in creating and sustaining X, and in attending to X, the determinacy of the properties of X is experienced as belonging to my experience of X rather than X itself. Okay. So in this sense, our experiences seem to actively cause the internal objects, and I put objects in inverted commas there because I don't necessarily mean that mental images are objects in the mind, obviously, have any sort of ontological reality. Okay, so that's the basic difference that I mean here by visualization not being transparent. Okay, in the same way that visual perception is. Okay, I'm just trying to think whether I can't come back to that. I can't remember now. Let's see. Anyway, so here's the summary of where we got to. Okay, so merely appealing to the role of attention in structuring the content of perceptual and imagistic experience doesn't ensure the similarity of phenomenal character. Okay? At least not without a kind of strong representationalist assumption in the background. In fact, I think it demonstrates the dissimilarity of phenomenal character and content. In the case of visualization, but not perceptual experience, this content seems to us to be entirely a top-down result of my agency and my willed attention. And attending in a top-down way to internally generated images is therefore phenomenally very different from attending to externally generated perceptual experiences that are presented to us in a bottom-up way. Okay, and it's this phenomenal dissimilarity that explains why we rarely confuse the two states. Okay, that's the summary of where we are. Okay, now Nane makes quite a bit of how the empirical, in particular the neuroscientific studies of how visual imagery works, goes into supporting his view. Now, it certainly doesn't conflict with his view, but I don't think it adds anything in the way of particularly interesting support, as we'll see in a second. But we can say, I think, quite a bit about what might explain the neural underpinnings of the phenomenal difference that I'm concerned with. Now, we can say a bit, but it's tricky. And I think that's partly because looking at the neuroscientific literature, the relationship between attention, agency, and imagery are not really well charted. And I think there are a number of quite interesting reasons for this. Firstly, there are many types of imagery and imagistic experiences that employ many different areas of the brain. Okay. So, if you talk to someone like Adam Zeman, who's an expert in the neuroscience of imagery, he won't be able to give you a very kind of short or clear answer about, which parts of the brain are responsible for imagery. Okay. The neurological mechanisms responsible for attention, as well as those responsible for monitoring agency, are not really very well understood. Okay. So, there is a sort of identification of various attention networks in the brain, but there's quite a lot of uncertainty about those networks and their relationships to each other. And, the research actually focusing on attention in neuroscience doesn't, at least to my knowledge, significantly overlap with that focused on imagery. Okay. So what little overlap there is what I spend really a lot of work doing as a kind of background to what is now this talk. But comes out of a much more extended paper about the relationship between attention and imagining. Okay, so there are lots of uncertainties here, and a lot of this is more or less speculative, obviously to some degree. But I think it's nevertheless worth exploring. Okay, but that just could be because I'm quite interested in neuroscience, and if you're not, you might think that this part of the talk is pointless. So there's a lot of evidence that demonstrates that visual imagery utilizes many of the same neural correlates of actual vision, okay, particularly in the primary visual cortex. As Nane says, when we attend to a visualized scene, our eye movements correspond to that of the real scene, okay? And if subjects are asked not to move their eyes during visualizing, they have difficulties imagining the scene. By the way, I think this is quite interesting because some people have said, I think McGinn says this, he says that, we can't scan our imagery. I think maybe he gets that from Sartre. And if that's true, then that would seem to conflict, at least prima facie, with this empirical evidence. I could go on, but there are lots of kind of interesting overlaps. Just to take one more, visual imagery can have functional effects on sensory processing as if it were indeed a weaker form of visual perception. So, for example, Joel Pearson has done a lot of experiments on this kind of thing. Imagining and perceiving oriented lines can have a similar effect on subsequent perception. Okay, so when we conjure up, as it were, visual imagery, those images can actually last as something like traces in our visual system that actually affect our visual experience. Okay, so there is clearly kind of overlap here. Nevertheless, what's interesting about this overlap is that, as the neuroscientist Pearson says in this really, really good overview of the neuroscience of imagery, he says, why does imagery rarely feel as strong and vivid as afferent sensory perception? Right? Given that the neurological overlaps are significant. Okay. Well, one functional answer, of course, which should seem quite obvious, is that we need to keep track of the difference between perception and imagination. Okay. And this would explain the phenomenal difference. There's a phenomenal difference because we need the functional difference to be in place. Obviously, we don't want to confuse perception and imagining. But a further, I think, more interesting and slightly deeper level of explanation would be to show that the sources of attention and hence the resulting determinacy of each are different. And it's precisely the difference between top-down and bottom-up attention that might play a role in explaining, at least partly, this phenomenal difference. Okay. Well, how would it do that? Well, a quick answer would be to say that top-down endogenous attention comes with the feeling of agency, right? That I'm trying to claim goes a long way to explaining, the phenomenal difference between visualizing and visual perception. Now, Curry and Ravenscroft a long time ago said this. They thought that a plausible way of making sense of certain cases of delusion is that subjects fail to recognize imaginings as such because they have a general deficit in the recognition of agency. And I think something like that is along the right lines, right? So I think there is this tight connection between agency and imagining, and I think the key then is to try to understand what exactly is this awareness of agency, and where does it come from? Okay, so I think where it comes from is just simply this functional difference, right? That the endogenous attention, we need to be able to distinguish between the two types of attention, because we need to be able to distinguish imagining from perceiving in general. But what exactly this awareness of agency is, and how we should characterize it, is something, as I've said before, I'm a bit unclear about still. Now, what's interesting about top-down attention is that imagery also seems to be very top-down. So despite the kind of overlapping with the visual cortex, when people are asked to imagine things deliberately, and not to sort of just remember things, when you put them in fMRI scanners and so on, also when you use EEG, which has a it's much more fine-grained for distinguishing the temporality of the signals, it's pretty clear, there's a lot of consensus that imagery employs something like a reverse visual hierarchy. Okay, so what happens is that, in contrast to visual experience, which starts at the back of the brain essentially, the initial mental action to create a mental image begins at the front of the brain, high in the cortical processing hierarchy in the frontal cortex. It then seems to trigger a cascade of different neural events running backwards, involving retrieving stored information from memories and from more posterior regions like medial temporal areas. And it's in this way that sensory and spatial representations of the imagery content are then formed. Okay, so again, there's a very nice overview by Pearson in a recent paper about the top-down nature of imagistic imagining. Okay. All right, so there are some connections. A further interesting connection has to do with agency, although this one is much more speculative. But a lot has been made of it in the neuroscience of imagining recently. So in books like the book by Gabriel Starr on the feeling of beauty, the one by Anjan Chatterjee on the neuroscience of aesthetic experience. Sorry, the titles have just gone out of my brain right now, but anyway, a lot is made of the default mode network in the production of imagery, and then in the analysis of aesthetic experience. I'm not going to be talking about aesthetic experience here, but certainly there's a connection with the default mode network. So I don't know how many of you've heard of this thing. Some neuroscientists think it doesn't exist. So a neuroscientist I'm collaborating with at the moment thinks it doesn't exist, which is a bit annoying for me, because I like the idea of what I'm about to say and how it might relate and explain certain things. In any case, the DMN, the default mode network, is just a networked group of brain areas, including the ones I've listed here, which I won't read out, so I won't bore you. It's generally deactivated when subjects are performing a task which demands sustained external attention. And for this reason, it's kind of associated with daydreaming and mind wandering, the kinds of things you do in an fMRI scanner when you're not being asked to look at stuff or to make judgments about externally presented objects. It seems to be centrally involved in past, future-directed and fictional imagery. And it's also heavily implicated in self-generated thoughts, including in particular autobiographical memories and future plans. Now, there's quite a debate about exactly what the relationship is between self-generated thoughts and imagery. And that's because obviously a lot of the imagery that's going to be involved in mind wandering will probably be self-directed. Okay, so the correlation between sort of imagery and self-directed thought could go in any number of ways. So, whether the DMN is primarily responsible for imagery and it just so happens that a lot of our imagery is self-directed, or it's primarily involved in self-directed thoughts, and most of your self-directed thoughts are going to be maybe directed towards the past or the future, and therefore necessarily will involve, or almost inevitably involve, imagery. I think it's anybody's guess at the moment, but that's the rough kind of connection. Now, what's interesting about the default mode network is that it seems to bear a particular relationship to kind of external, exogenous attention. In particular, there's this phenomenon of perceptual decoupling, which people talk about. So the default mode network shows an anti-correlation with the main attention network in the brain, the dorsal attention network, which is responsible for visuospatial processing and externally driven attention. Okay, so when one is active, the other is suppressed, and vice versa. And this suggests a kind of competitive relationship between an internal focus of attention, right, to imagery and self-generated thought, and external attention to concurrent environmental stimuli. You can have there's a nice overview in Spring of this. Okay. Well, what does all this show? Well, I don't know exactly what it shows, but I think, look, it shows, if anything, that there's some neurological evidence that at least I think helps explain the common view that attending to imagery competes with other attentional resources, right? The idea that when you're asked to imagine something, a natural thing to do is to close your eyes, okay, and to stop engaging with the external world. I mean, was it Wittgenstein who said something about, you can't both look at an apple and imagine or have an image of an apple at one and the same time. I don't know if that's true. I can't remember why he said that, but I mean, that would be a view about how there's kind of competition for attentional resources in both states. This kind of evidence, I think, at least suggests that two different attention networks might be at play here, one internally focused, the other externally focused. There is also, by the way, some literature on another network in the brain that mediates between the two, but I've left that out of this talk. It also shows, I think, therefore, that there's a possible neural kind of mechanism or mechanisms underpinning the different phenomenal character and content of voluntary world visual imagery vis-a-vis visual perception, partly in terms of the different types of attention devoted to each. Okay, so this would be the sort of neural underpinnings of the phenomenal differences I've been highlighting. I don't know how long have I been talking for? Not too bad. Okay, I'm almost finished.
You have about still 5 minutes.
Perfect. Okay.
But you can even talk up to 10 minutes if you like.
Okay, I don't think this will take very long. So I said at the start, by way of introduction, that this paper is a bit of a hodgepodge of different things. And here's where I get to, how does any of this bear on the nature of fictional immersion? Okay, so this is something I'm a bit unsure of, but I think we can explain. I think we need to explain, the phenomenon of being immersed in fiction. And originally, I wrote a paper on this. There was a response to the kind of paradox of fiction. How can we be emotionally moved by and towards fictional things that we know are fictional? I thought, well, clearly it's got something to do with the role of attention. Okay, and clearly, the more we're immersed in a fictional narrative, to that extent, the less we're paying attention to the external world, to put it very, very roughly. Okay, so I think if we can think about the different role that attention plays and the different types of attention involved in attending to imagery and to perceptual objects, we might learn something about the nature of fictional immersion from this. And I'm going to start in a slightly roundabout way here. So here's a quote from O'Shaughnessy. He says, now he's talking about propositional imagining here, which complicates matters a bit, but I think we can just apply it also to objectual imagining of the type I'm concerned with in visualization. So O'Shaughnessy says, in imagining that P, one has as the focus of one's mental attention only the state of affairs picked out by P. It follows that, among other things, mental attention to one's epistemic relationship to P is excluded for the duration of the imagining. Hence, in a currently imagining that P, one is not currently thinking of the fact that one only imagines that P, or does not believe that P, or that P is not true. Okay. So I'll just leave that up for a second so you can digest that. Okay, so O'Shaughnessy put, from memory, this is quite a strong point. So he puts this as a sort of condition on what it is to imagine, right? That this is the case. Okay, imagining that P. So now we can ask, the awareness of agency, which I've been claiming is kind of central to what it is to imagine and to explaining the phenomenal difference between imagining and perceiving. We can ask, is the awareness of agency then an awareness of one's epistemic relationship to P? Okay. And if it is, then my account would seem to clash directly with O'Shaughnessy's account of imagining. Okay, because according to O'Shaughnessy, just remember, one sort of fails to imagine insofar as one is, as it were, focusing on or paying attention to one's epistemic relationship to P, right, to the fact that one is, say, merely imagining. That's one thing. I don't really care that I clash with O'Shaughnessy. Maybe O'Shaughnessy's just wrong. But I think this does maybe pose a problem for certain ways of thinking about how fictional immersion works. Okay, so here's the first problem. Okay, so the first problem is that awareness that one is only imagining, so this would be a kind of epistemic relationship to P, would indeed seem to preclude or at least to hinder an ability to be fictionally immersed. Okay, so if you're engaged in, say, reading a fiction, but you're constantly, as it were, focusing on or aware of at the foreground of your conscious awareness, that you're merely imagining, okay, that this is fictional, to that extent, one might expect your fictional immersion to be hindered. Okay. So one quick answer to this that I want to make while keeping sort of agency at the center here is to say that, well, attention comes in degrees, and awareness of agency, I think, could probably be more or less foregrounded or backgrounded. By the way, this is the most speculative part of the talk. I don't know if any of this is plausible or not. That's why it's a quick answer. The awareness of intention and effort that go into forming images is not the same, I don't think, as the awareness that this is what I'm doing. Right? It's not the same as the bare sort of epistemic thought or judgment I am merely imagining. Now, what is the difference here? Well, the difference, I think, is hard to characterize. I don't know how to do it. This is what I meant when I said, what exactly is this awareness of agency? I mean, I'm inclined to say something like this, but I know it's not very satisfying or illuminating. I would say that the awareness of agency involved in imagining and visualizing involves some kind of pre-reflective, perhaps non-cognitive, maybe felt kind of sense of what one is doing, whereas the latter is a judgment, essentially, about what one is doing. Or maybe it's a sort of it's a level of awareness that's one removed, right, from the kind of awareness of agency involved in the first order, just creating and sustaining an image. And if something like that is right, then fictional immersion, would succeed where the awareness of agency is not itself foregrounded in attention, perhaps. That might be one way of saying it. On the other hand, if the awareness of agency involves some kind of non-cognitive kind of sense of agency, then perhaps even if it's foregrounded, that won't interfere itself with the process of being immersed. Okay, so I don't really know what to say other than that. The second problem is slightly different. So remember I said there was a kind of anti-correlation between internal and external attention, between the default mode network, internally generated kind of imagery and self-directed thoughts, and external attention. So when one is activated, the other isn't. Well, that might seem to pose a problem for fictional immersion. Okay? Because insofar as your ability to be immersed in a fiction involves paying attention to the, as it were, the fictional object, I mean, the object that gives rise to your fictional thoughts, your thoughts about the fiction, and to that extent, it doesn't seem possible to be able to pay the right kind of attention to be fictionally immersed. Or else, maybe at best, what we would have is a sort of constant oscillation between external and internal attention. Now, I think there are complexities here about what sort of fictions we're thinking of, and whether you think, say, the imagination is involved, for example, in the experience of film, theatre. What to say about those? So I'm going to stick with literary fictions. So here you might think there's going to be a tension between the attention I have to pay externally to simply the book I'm holding and the words I'm reading on the page, and of course to the meaning of those words on the one hand, and whatever attention is going to be involved in whatever imagery accompanies that reading process. So how can we make sense of this, given there's this kind of potential anti-correlation between two very different types of attention? Well, one very quick and unconvincing response would be to say, well, all of this is a bit messy, there are overlaps, attention comes in degrees, so this kind of anti-correlation can't be absolute. Okay, you might say something like that. Sometimes images and perceptions get mixed up. Sometimes it's not clear whether you're paying attention to an image or to the thing the image is of. Maybe that's right. Maybe the Perky experiments show that those things maybe are more common than we think. But I think a more interesting response would go along these lines, and this is maybe the last slide or second last slide. And it's to do with the reading process. Okay, so there's a recent paper by Brosh where I get this from. So she covers a lot of neuroscientific experiments and evidence that seem to show that especially vivid images occur when readers are forced to shift from action-oriented visualization to object visualization. So, I mean, I don't know how many of you know this, but generally it's thought that there are two quite separate streams in the visual processing hierarchy in the brain. One is the ventral stream, one is the dorsal stream. The dorsal stream is essentially concerned with where are things happening. The ventral stream is often called the kind of what stream. What is it that we're paying attention to? Okay, so one is sort of dynamic, the other is kind of static, concerned with objects. Now, it seems that a lot of this evidence shows that dynamic imagery is significantly less vivid than static imagery, according to the reader's experiences. Relatively still objects, as I just said, are processed by the ventral stream, which is also slower slower at processing, and it's used for object and form recognition. Now, some interesting kind of literature there. Dangley suggests that increased vividness in the production of mental images while reading is due to a predominance of object visualization. So it's those passages in literary texts where people are forced to kind of stop and just stop going along with the sort of narrative flow, as it were, and really start imagining concretely, what the object, or whatever it is that's being described in detail, is like. And forming this kind of detailed mental image seems to take quite a lot of time, relatively speaking, and doesn't seem to permit the reader time. I mean, generally, the dynamic reading process of a text, where we've got sort of narrative action, doesn't permit the reader time to construct and sustain this kind of visual image while still maintaining the flow of reading. Okay, so the kind of flow of the reading process that enables, to some extent, fictional immersion is kind of hindered by the kind of vivid imagery that we are more or less kind of forced to create when confronted with static, detailed descriptions of things that we're supposed to imagine. Okay. So this, I think, can be made sense of in the kind of view that I've been talking about in this way. So when the kind of effort is there that's required to construct, say, a vivid static image, one becomes more aware of the agency involved, and the reading process itself therefore slows down, perhaps to the point of a loss of immersion, or certainly to an attenuation of immersion. So the more your awareness of agency is foregrounded in that sense, the less immersed, as it were, you might be. On the other hand, when the engagement with the narrative is more sort of automatic and dynamic, the visualization is kind of faster, perhaps to that extent more resembles involuntary than voluntary imagery. Okay, your brain is sort of working on the author's descriptions, but not in such a way that you're taking much time to do it. So therefore, you might not even be aware of your kind of own agency in creating those images, and therefore we're no longer talking about the kind of conscious willed voluntary imagery that I've been talking about. So that's the kind of hazy finish to the talk, which I agree is more suggestive and kind of concrete, and just shows that I think there are kind of interesting relations that can be further explored here, but which I haven't tied up very kind of rigorously or as clearly as I might have done. But that's it. So thanks a lot. Oh, silent clapping. That's interesting. I like silent clapping.